Welcome everyone back to Drisha for more learning during Sephira. And we're especially excited about this class, not just because it's National Poetry Month and we like the opportunity to hook ourselves on the happenings of the world, but Mr. Daniel Kraft gave a class for us earlier in this academic year, and I had people pounding down my inbox at the door of my inbox demanding that we bring him back for more on the same sort of material, and he was very gracious in obliging us. So we're here for the poetry of Jewish memory. As we're all aware, we're coming off of Yom HaShoah, and next week we will have Yom HaZikaron. So it seemed very appropriate to expand on the work we did previously with Yiddish poetry as Holocaust theology into the wider world of Jewish memory in poetry. So in this course, we will consider how great poems from a variety of languages present the nature and experience of Jewish memory. Through readings and discussions of poetry with a particular emphasis on modern poetry, we will explore the ways that Jews remember the past, carry the past into the future, and turn to literary creativity as a way of expressing and realizing the complex dynamics of Jewish remembrance. And for those of you who haven't met our wonderful presenter before, Mr. Daniel Kraft is a writer, translator, and educator living in Richmond, Virginia. He holds a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School, where he was a Harry Austen Wolfson Fellow in Jewish Studies and a resident at the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions. Daniel has taught at conferences, synagogues, and museums in North America and Poland, and at Drisha. He's been doing very wonderful Yiddish translation workshops that people adore, myself included. And his work has been supported by residencies, fellowships, and scholarships from institutions including the National Yiddish Book Center, the Community of Writers, and the Glenn Workshop. His poems, essays, and translations appear in a number of publications, and he shares translations of Yiddish poetry in his newsletter at danielkraft.substack.com. Without further ado, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for all of your work setting this up, and thank you for inviting me to be here to be a part of this programming again. It's always a pleasure to be a part of Drisha's really rich slate of classes and programs. Yeah, so our topic tonight, as hopefully you know, in case you're in the wrong place, is the poetry of Jewish memory. So the question we're going to be exploring, or questions we're going to be exploring, is what is Jewish memory? What does it mean to talk about Jewish memory and to experience Jewish memory? And how does poetry express that and enact that? So what we're going to be doing tonight, we'll start, since this is the first in a few weeks session, we'll start with some kind of bigger picture framing, brief sources, and then we'll just really dive into poems. So since it, I guess I'm seeing how dark it is out, since it still is Yom HaShoah here, we'll be focusing tonight not exclusively on poetry related to the Holocaust, but in large part about poetry, the Holocaust in particular, and of catastrophe in general, right? How do Jews turn to poetry to respond to catastrophes, historical catastrophes, and how does that manifest through Jewish memory? But before we dive into the poems, I wanted to just look at a few different sources that are, for me at least, interesting, meaningful framings, or at least provocative opportunities for questioning about what we talk about when we talk about Jewish poetry. So the first one I have here is from Jonathan Safran Foer, the novelist. This is from his novel, Everything is Illuminated, which some people here might be familiar with. And I'm really curious to hear what people's thoughts are. I find this to be a really interesting source. So he writes here: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, memory. While Gentiles experience and process the world through their traditional senses and use memory only as a second-order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. It is only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks. When his mother tried to fix his sleeve while his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, "What does it remember like?" There's a lot that we could say about this brief passage. I don't know that I really, endorse this clear distinction between Gentile sense experience and Jewish sense experience, but I think what he is saying here is something really interesting. This idea that for Jews, memory is itself a first order sense, as immediately, as viscerally as touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing, right? That this question, what does it remember like, can be as meaningful and as kind of immediately accessible as a question of what something tastes like or smells like, or whatever the case may be. So I'm curious to hear if anybody has any general responses to this source. It's always a little bit risky in this kind of webinar to say, does anybody have any general responses? So if there's silence, we'll just move on. But I just, I really want to be clear that I'm happy for this to be a conversation and not just me talking.
Well, this specific framing, I don't know that I specifically would want to address, but the notion of Jews having memory as a sense, like I feel that's very resonant for people who are in the Torah teaching world, because there's always this question about, is this a historic document? Is this real? And we know scientifically that the way we remember our memories isn't exactly historically accurate. It's all very subjective. And I think that culturally being able to kind of take ownership of that subjectivity and treat it as something sensual is, I don't want to say special, but it's important to me. So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I agree with that. I don't really quite know what to make of this text as a whole, to be totally honest. And it's part of a novel, so it's not, not some philosophical argument here. But there is something that I find really compelling and accurate, I think, about this idea that for Jews, the experience of memory is a tangible, sensual experience. It's not an abstraction. It's not just an idea, but that is really something that we feel in our bodies. So that's sort of why I wanted to open with this, because for me, that's a powerful reminder to not just think about memories as ideas, but really as embodied experiences. Awesome. We'll move on a little bit. And this text actually, this next source that I just want to introduce briefly, actually goes along really well with what Noah was just saying. So this is from Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who was a very important 20th century Jewish historian. And he writes, although Judaism throughout the ages was absorbed with the meaning of history, historiography itself played at best an ancillary role among the Jews and often no role at all. And concomitantly, I don't actually know how you pronounce that word, but I think it's something like that, that while memory of the past was always a central component of Jewish experience, the historian was not its primary custodian. So memory is essential, this central component of Jewish experience, but not necessarily as refracted by historians. So where does this come from then? It may help to point out that in repeatedly employing such terms as collective memory or group memory, I do not have in mind some vaguely genetic endowment, not an innate psychic structure analogous to the Jungian archetypes. Only the group can bequeath both language and a transpersonal memory. Even individual memory is structured through the conscious efforts and institutions of the group. And here he's talking about memory in general, but Jewish memory in particular. And I wanted to mention this source to be clear about something that when we talk about Jewish memory, it's not something, oh, I'm trying to highlight this, that we're the passive recipients of, right? Our memories are structured through the efforts and institutions of the group that we're a part of. And in this case, we don't passively accept Jewish memories. We're not just the kind of empty recipients of what this thing called Jewish memory is. I think he's saying something really important here. When we have and experience Jewish memory, that's something that is consciously created by Jewish culture, not just by academic historians, but by the cultural and liturgical and religious and communal experiences of Jewish life. It's not something passive, it's something that's very actively created. And I think as I've come to see, one of the ways that is created so powerfully is through poetry. We'll look down just one more brief text about memory. This is a little bit of a hodgepodge, but I just kind of wanted to throw some things out here. So we have this classic biblical statement, right? One of the commandments of Shabbat, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho, right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And what I'm really interested here is the relationship between these two things. Remember Shabbat in order to keep it holy. Or you could think about this, translate it maybe as remember Shabbat for its holiness. And one of the things that this suggests to me is that remembrance here is being commanded not just for its own sake, not just for an abstraction, but there's something that comes from that remembrance. The remembrance and the holiness and our responsibility to enact that holiness in some way are totally intertwined. So remembrance here doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to a way of being and a way of acting in the world. And I think that's another essential component of Jewish memory. So I have one more source here, but I decided we're going to push this one off to next week. So stay tuned. We'll discuss that then. But before we move on, I just wanted to open with these three very brief sources. The Jonathan Safran Foer quote, this Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi quote, and then this one verse from the Torah, just to kind of offer some different ways of thinking about what Jewish memory is and what it does. And before we move into the poems that are going to be the topic or our topic for tonight, does anyone have any responses, comments, questions to any of these sources or any of the ways that I've articulated why I'm interested in them? Does that resonate with you? Do these resonate? Would you disagree? Yeah, to any responses, I would be happy to hear and to make that space for others to share before we move on.
If you're in the room, feel free to just unmute and jump in. If you're an attendee and you would like to speak, you can use the little hand raise function, and everyone's welcome to put items in the chat.
Yes, thank you. And there's no pressure to talk either. The Zoom stuff, it can be hard to just speak into the void on a Zoom meeting like this. So I appreciate anybody who wants to share any thoughts or questions that you might have right now. But if not, we'll go ahead and move on into our poems themselves. Oh, so the main thing that I wanted to say before we start on these poems, though, is that I actually don't have a specific answer, right? What is Jewish memory? What does that mean? I don't know. And I don't want to go through these poems as if they are offering us definitive answers to this question of what is Jewish memory, or definitive ways that they're fitting into the framework for what Jewish memory is. What I would rather do is treat each of these poems that we're going to look at as if it is making its own particular argument about what Jewish memory is. So rather than saying, oh, how does this fit into our preconceived idea of Jewish memory? My hope is that we can look at these poems and think, what is this poem saying about what Jewish memory is? Right? What is this poem offering us that we might not have seen otherwise or elsewhere about what it means to remember as Jews? So the rest of the evening we'll be looking at and discussing poems. And what I've tried to do is create kind of a hodgepodge of poems and poets that people, some might be more familiar, some might be less familiar. You know, I'm really excited. This is just kind of my own idiosyncratic anthology of poetry here that we'll be getting over the next few weeks. So I'm really excited to share and to discuss these poems with you. So as I mentioned, I know some people came later, since it's Yom HaShoah, we'll be thinking specifically about how Jewish poems respond to catastrophe, with the Holocaust in particular, but not exclusively. And of course, for me, the archetypal Jewish poems are the poems in the Book of Psalms, right? The Psalms are in some ways like the high point of all Jewish poetry. And if the Psalms are archetypal Jewish poetry, then the archetypal Jewish poem of catastrophe is Psalm 137, for me at least. You know, how do we respond to catastrophe through poetry? And how do we think about memory through poetry, through Jewish poetry? So what I'll do is read, I have two translations of this psalm. I'll read the first one. We'll say very brief things about it, and then we'll read the second translation, and then we'll have a little bit more of a conversation. So this is the standard JPS edition translation of this psalm, and we'll read it. All of the poems we'll be looking at today will be in English translation. So by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. I've read this psalm so many times, and every time that last line just kind of takes me by surprise. And I do have this quote from Robert Alter here, where he says, no moral justification can be offered for this notorious concluding line, which I happen to think is true, but also relatively uninteresting. Because I'm much more interested for our purposes tonight with the question of what this says about memory, what it is to remember, how we remember and why we remember, and what it actually consists of, and how this blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks, what does that, right? What is that arguing Jewish memory is about? Yeah, so this is the translation from the standard JPS edition. I'm seeing a question here. Are you asking, was this translation chosen for a particular reason, or was the poem? Yeah, so I chose this translation for the particular reason that for me is just kind of a middle of the line basic translation, and would be a good way of introducing the poem and the conversation. But this is you know, one of the classic Psalms, and people like to quote a lot, right? This, if I forget you, O Jerusalem part, and tend to forget a little bit about that unsettling conclusion. So let's go ahead and actually, before we move into the next translation of this, I wanted to look at them together. But what are people noticing here about what this poem says about Jewish memory, right? What does it mean to remember as Jews? And what does it consist of, according to this poem? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? One of the things that's sort of jumping out to me here is that memory is tied to capability in the world, and specifically capability of expression. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. So it's through remembering in some way, through remembering Jerusalem, that we're able to speak. I think we can extrapolate this a little bit more broadly to say that one of the arguments this poem is making is that it's through the things that we remember as Jews that we are then able to communicate, pray, express ourselves, sing, right? Our creative expression or generation is in some essential way here tied to the fact that we remember. And if we lose our memories, then we lose those creative capabilities or, powers of expression. I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but I hope it's clear what I mean there. But does anybody have any other thoughts about this so far?
I had one thought and then I had another thought that I started thinking while you were speaking, as tends to happen. So the first thought is traditionally, this is the psalm that people would recite before doing the blessing after meals on days that are not holidays. That's not a common practice anymore, but there are still communities and individuals who do it. So I very much associate the tongue cleaving to the roof of the mouth with, you literally can't open your mouth to eat.
Oh, great.
And you can't use your hands to, pick up your food, pick up your bread and eat it so you can make the blessing. But to see the transition in this poem from our provocateurs insisting that we play music and sing for them, sing a happy little Jew song, as they, encourage us to do, to, as you mentioned, this more, I guess, value neutral idea of expression, to then having those hands that would be playing music, smashing babies, is pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, this poem really traverses a lot of territory. I mean, there's a lot of kind of wild transitions here. But yeah, I agree. It's a challenging poem in a lot of ways. There was a hand raised and then it went away from my screen.
I think it might be my hand. Are you?
Oh, perfect. Yes, great.
Yeah. Well, I just really want to say about the dashing the babies against the rocks. I don't really feel one needs to apologize for it because I don't think it should be taken literally. It's an expression of rage and that belongs in a poem. And it of course reminds me of Shvo Chamatcha, which people are equally apologetic about. But from my point of view, that's a legitimate response because it's not to be taken literally. So I just wanted to put that into the conversation.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that comment. I think this is one of the challenges with this kind of poetry is like, what do we think is intended to be literal? What do we think is intended to be a kind of figure, a stand-in for this intense emotionality? I think I would have been more inclined to agree with not seeing it literally had I not been reading recently and doing some writing as well about the attempt of Holocaust survivors to kill 1 million Jewish or German children and 5 million, whatever. There was this whole Holocaust survivor network that attempted to kill 6 million German civilians in response to the Holocaust. And that was a very literal thing. And so I couldn't read this time without thinking about that whole saga and the ways that people in responding to catastrophe and trauma really do want to inflict this kind of terrible harm onto others. But I think that's totally a fair point. And certainly I'm not the only, I'm not the sole holder of readings here. So I'm glad that you said that. And I think it is worth asking, right? Why do we need to apologize for this? And what are the stakes of apologizing versus not apologizing? But Chaya, were you gonna add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to what Noah said before, and sort of connect it to what you were saying, because I'm thinking also about that moment of after eating, and I thought that Noah was going to say the following, but I'm thinking about need, but because I'm also thinking of like how we say before Amida, we say Hashem Sfatai Tiftach, right? And needing something to allow us to pray. And I'm thinking, I thought that what Noah was going to say is that we can't pray without acknowledging this, which also seems to like it itself is right. Ich nashir Hashem. It's about not being able to. It's I don't want to like limit it too much, but it's some sort of religious thing. And I think it's connected to what you were saying about expression because it's religious expression. But I wonder, this feels to me a little more like midrashic, but I wonder if you could say something about this really troubling verse afterwards and think about like this trauma suspending our ability to like act in moral ways or engage with the world in the normal sort of norms of ethics that we're used to. And I'm thinking about like we can't pray and we want to harm babies. And yeah, I'm wondering if I'm just thinking about needing something getting in the way of our prayer, and sort of two separate things. One of them is what does it take to be able to pray? Seems like not this, whatever this is. And separately, like maybe some sort of undermining of our moral universe. Again, that to me feels a little more drush-like, but I'm wondering if you could see that as like a theme in this, in this parak as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's phenomenal. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of taking from what you're saying here, and one of the ways that I see this psalm as a poem and as a piece of liturgy is that it's about the stakes of remembering and the stakes of forgetting. So, right, like on the one hand, if we forget, then I think as you're saying, Chaya, we lose our ability to pray. Our ability to pray as Jews is in some way contingent on our ability to remember as Jews. That's one of the ways that I read this poem. But then the flip side there, right, is that if we remember without a kind of balance to that remembering, we wind up wanting to kill babies, or we at least run the risk of that, right? If we hold these memories of our trauma without balancing them with other concerns. And I don't really know what that means exactly, but to me, this is like, that's sort of what I take away from this. On the one hand, memory is so important. Well, yeah, actually, maybe that's how I want to put it. This shows how powerful and necessary memory is, because we need it to pray, and it also might make us want to kill babies. It is so intensely powerful and essential a force in Jewish life, and so we need to be aware of it and understand the ways that we are using it and experiencing it. Because the stakes are so high, at least according to this poem, as I understand it. We'll look briefly at this next translation, which is from David Rosenberg, who's, I think, best known for co-writing a novel with Harold Bloom. Really kind of an interesting figure. I will just say a brief note that one of the things this translation does, which I find very compelling, is make explicit some of the sort of imagery of sexual violence that I think is implicit in some of the language of the psalm. So just a heads up. But this is David Rosenberg's translation. Into the rivers of Babylon we cried like babies, loud, unwilling to move beyond the memory, the flowing blood of you, Israel. To an orchestra of trees we lent our harps, silently leaning, when the enemy shoved us, asking tender songs of Israel under heavy chains. Give us songs of Israel, as if we could give our mouths to a strange landlord. If I forget thee, sweet Jerusalem, let my writing hand wither, my tongue freeze to ice, sealing up my voice, my mind numb as rock. If I forget your kiss, Jerusalem, on my lips. My Lord remembers you, Edomites, Jerusalem, raped vivid as daylight, you who screamed to strip her naked to the ground. O Lady Babylon, Babylon the destroyer, lucky man who holds you, who crushes you, who opens your mind to wither instantly in air, who holds up your crying babies as if to stun them against solid rock. And this is David Rosenberg's translation. You're starting to see what I mean when I see this class will be just my own kind of idiosyncratic anthology of poems that I just love and am fascinated by. And I'm fascinated by this translation. I think it's weird and powerful and beautiful, and I don't quite know what to do with it. But there are a lot of moments that just as poetry are incredible to me here. As if we could give our mouths to a strange landlord. What a cool little line there, right? But a few things to note here that I think are relevant again to this. In the second stanza, unwilling to move beyond the memory, the flowing blood of you, Israel. I think there are a few ways that we can read that. One is, right, the memory of the blood that has been spilt. But another way to read that is the memory, the flowing blood, as in memory is the flowing blood of Israel. I think it's kind of a masterful poetic moment that he gives us both those possible readings, beyond the memory, the flowing blood of you, Israel, because it suggests to me that at the same time that this memory is a memory of trauma, memory is also the lifeblood that animates Israel, that animates the Jewish people. Both of those things are true at once. And I think this poem really dives into the complexities and challenges of that. You also notice it's really interesting to me because he really heightens the awfulness of some of the violence here. It's parts of this are quite hard to read, right? And then this last stanza, he really softens it from the original. Who holds up your crying babies as if to stun them against solid rock. So that as if is doing a lot of work there to pull us away from the discomfort of the original psalm. But again, I think we're seeing similar themes here. The stakes and the power of memory. We need memory in the original psalm to pray, to sing, as Noah's suggesting, to eat. And here, it's more explicitly, we need memory in order to write, in order to speak, in order to think, in order to have a Jewish consciousness. This poem suggests we have to be able to remember. Any thoughts, comments on this before we move a couple thousand years into the future?
Oh yeah.
Great.
My first thought was just like, this is one of those ongoing, perpetual, permanent controversies in the translation world in general, but this is really straddling the line between translation and interpretation. Chaya referred to it as a rendering. That's, a fair general way to put it. But all translation is, political in some way. And this one is, whoa, he is very much telling us how to read this, and painting it a certain way. And as you pointed out, just the lighting on the violence really does change things a lot, because we have a lot of, I'd call it violent fantasies in Jewish works where people think, if I had power, I would be violent, but it doesn't come to pass in a lot of cases. I won't say most, but in the Torah, Jacob's brother was going to kill him, said he was going to do it, obviously didn't. Otherwise the book probably would have ended there. But this, is much richer, and I don't want to call it immoral in a way, but it definitely taps into the experience of women who have been assaulted and people who have been, violated more broadly, which I think we don't always necessarily feel without this type of rendering, because we go from, we're enslaved, being dragged off to Babylon, and they're trying to get us to sing for them. Now I'm going to turn inside and talk about my thoughts and my feelings. This, I think, creates a lot of, I won't call it midrashic because I'm sure some of it was, quite literally like this, but it makes it much more of a visible story as opposed to just internal feelings.
Yeah, it makes it a visible story. I like that phrase. I think that's exactly right. It takes it away from this idea, this kind of abstractions of like, oh yeah, the destruction of Jerusalem, where it's very easy for me, maybe for others as well, to hear these descriptions in Tanakh of the destruction of Jerusalem and to kind of hear it as a cliche, frankly, which is I honestly think my failing, but nevertheless, we've heard this stuff, these images so many times that it can be hard to find it shocking and in the ways that I think Jewish memory wants us to find it shocking. Chaya, were you going to say something? Your screen popped back up. Okay, awesome. Let's jump ahead in the interest of time, a couple thousand years. We're going to skip this poem from Yankov Glatstein, one of the great Yiddish poets of the Holocaust, but you can find this elsewhere. A very brief selection here, and there's a lot of good stuff from his online, so you're welcome to Google that. And I want to actually look briefly at something a little bit different from the ways that we normally think about Holocaust poetry. So this is, I have a poem here by Miklos Radnoti. It's translated by, I don't really know how to say this name, but Zuzana Ojvath and Frederick Turner. It's an incredible translation. I'll say a brief word about Radnoti, his life, and then we'll look at this poem together. So Miklos Radnoti was a Hungarian Jew. He was born in 1909. He was a really well-respected kind of younger Hungarian poet. He wrote in Hungarian. He was very assimilated as a Jew. He actually officially converted to Christianity in order to avoid some of the institutional discrimination that Jews then faced. But nevertheless, he kind of maintained this Jewish identity in complicated ways. And he was killed in 1944 by the Nazis, well, in a labor, sort of slave labor camp, essentially. And after he was killed, months later, after the war was over, his body was exhumed, and this notebook was taken from his jacket. And in this notebook were all of these poems that he wrote during the Holocaust while he was a slave laborer, essentially. And so that's what I wanted to look at next. One of these poems that was written probably around 1943. And I'm curious to hear what you think about, right, this opening question about what this poem says about Jewish memory. Right, today was Yom HaShoah, and so I was thinking about this as well. How is this poem similar to and different from the ways we normally think about Holocaust poetry? So I'm going to go ahead and read this poem. It's about a page and a half. It'll take a couple minutes. And yeah, I invite you to think about what kind of argument this poem is making about what memory is and how we should remember the Holocaust. I also just want to note that I think this is a totally masterful example of translation. So, we'll take it from there. But this is Miklos Radnoti's letter to my wife. Beneath the netherworld's deep, still, and mute, silence howls in my ears, and I cry out. No answer could come back. It is so far from that sad Serbia swooned into war, and you're so distant. But my heart redeems your voice all day, entangled in my dreams. So I am still, while close about me sough the great cold ferns that slowly stir and bow. When I'll see you, I don't know. You whose calm is as the weight and sureness of a psalm, whose beauty's like the shadow and the light, whom I could find if I were blind and mute, hide in the landscape now, and from within leap to my eye as if cast by my brain. You were real once. Now you have fallen into that deep well of teenage dreams again. Jealous interrogations tell me, speak, do you still love me? Will you on that peak of my past youth become my future wife? But now I fall awake to real life and know that's what you are, wife, friend of years, just far away. Beyond 3 wild frontiers and fall comes. Will it also leave with me? Kisses are sharper in the memory. Daylight and miracles seemed different things. Above the echelons of bombers' wings, skies once amazing blue with your eyes aglow are darkened now. Tight with desire to blow, the bombs must fall. I live in spite of these a prisoner. All of my fantasies I measure out, and I will find you still. For you I've walked the full length of the soul, the highways of countries, on coals of fire, if needs must, in the falling of the pyre. If all I have is magic, I'll come back. I'll stick as fast as bark upon an oak. And now that calm, whose habit is a power and weapon to the savage, in the hour of fate and danger falls as cool and true as does a wave, the sober 2 times 2. I don't really understand that ending, to be honest with you, but it's astonishing that he wrote this during the Holocaust, right? While he was a slave laborer. And so there is a lot of things that I think we could say about this, but for me, it really challenges the paradigm of what Holocaust poetry is and is supposed to be, and of how we can access the Holocaust and remember the Holocaust through poetry. Because if you ever look at a Holocaust poetry anthology or something like that, what you find are a lot of poems that are elegies, that are raging against the injustice and the murder, accusing God, accusing humanity. And this is such a different mode for a poem. And I think it does a few interesting things. We're thinking about memory. So I'm really interested in 2 moments here, right? You whose calm is as the weight and sureness of a psalm, which is a really beautiful moment, I think, just thinking about it as a love poem. But it's also a really interesting moment of Jewish memory, because what I see here is the poet refracting his relationship to his wife, his distant wife, refracting it through his relationship to the central texts of Judaism, one of which we just looked at, right? The book of Psalms. To me, this is an example of what Jonathan Safran Foer writes in that passage we opened with, when he says that a Jew asks, what does it remember like? Well, he's remembering his wife here, and through that remembering of her, that takes him to his relationship with the book of Psalms. So there's a way that he maps his memory of her onto his experience of these sacred Jewish texts. And then this second moment here, kisses are sharper in the memory, which I understand this line, the last line of this stanza, to be saying that these sensual experiences, they're not diminished by remembering them. They're actually heightened through memory, right? We might think, oh, that happened a long time ago. I remember how it felt to be with you, but that's much more, deadened to me now. And I think he's making the opposite argument, that through memory, things can become more visceral than they were in actuality. So those are the 2 things that I wanted to say about this poem, but I'm curious to hear if anybody else has any responses to anything that I just said, to this poem in general, or to how this poem functions for you as a poem of the Holocaust and what it says about how we might or should remember the Holocaust.
I think one of the interesting things for me in Holocaust remembrance, especially in communal settings, is how people measure loss within their families, within their communities, and people who did not lose someone directly sometimes feel like, what is my role in Holocaust remembrance and mourning? And I think a poem like this, in the context of being a Holocaust poem, brings to light how much was lost, how much is contained within a single life, and how much loss we aren't aware of. Because on the one hand, like 6 billion is a big number. On the other hand, it's a number. And actually recognizing the fullness of a person is a very difficult thing to do. And then we don't even know how many people suffered meaningful types of losses beyond what's been enumerated. The loss of youth, love, time spent with people, frolicking, being held captive on a chain gang instead of creating more memories with someone who, you're carrying around in your mind. And families losing memories, families who weren't able to recover, a book of poems, weren't able to hear these things from grandparents. It's pretty expansive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'll scroll to the end of poem there. Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, to me, this is in some ways a more powerful poem of Holocaust commemoration than a lot of poems that are more explicitly about the Holocaust. Because this shows me, just like you were just saying, not just the terrible thing that was done to this person, but the fullness of their life, irrespective of the terrible thing. And so it gives me a different sense of what the extent of the loss actually was. Yes, exactly. Not commemorating the Holocaust, commemorating what was there before the Holocaust. And that makes it, to me, actually all the more powerful as a Holocaust remembrance poem. Dad, were you gonna say something?
Could I make a comment? Yeah, thanks. The Sober 2x2. There's a great poem by the great lyric poet A.E. Housman that ends, to think that 2 and 2 is 4, and neither 5 nor 3, the heart of man has long been sore, and long 'tis like to be. The idea that 2 and 2 is 4 is a reality that we like to deny at times. And I just wonder if it sort of reminded me, the sober 2x2, it's 4, it's not 5 or 3, it's the reality of what our world is as opposed to what we'd like the world to be.
Yeah, that's really great, because it puts me in mind as well as this, if all I have is magic, I'll come back, which always really gets me in this poem. I don't quite know what that means, but having magic seems to me the opposite of 2x2. So it's this acknowledgement, like, I don't have magic. 2x2 is 4. And I'm subject to the brutal reality that I'm living under. And there's nothing, no magic, no poem, no crazy math. I don't know, that can really change that. Yeah. Let's go to just touch on a couple other poems with our little remaining time left. I'm going to just mention briefly the poems that we're not going to read so that you can look at them on your own if you would like. So Radnóti, whom we just looked at, was an early 20th century Hungarian poet. I have here an excerpt from a long poem by Szilárd Borbély, who's a Hungarian poet who died in 2014. I would call him Jew-ish. He wrote a autobiographical novel, excuse me, called The Dispossessed, which goes into this. It's a remarkable, exceptionally depressing book, but really an excellent book, where his family was Jewish, but they were the only surviving Jews in their village in communist Hungary. And so they kind of kept their Judaism hidden and, would secretly light candles and things like that. Complicated, fascinating story. So this is a really challenging poem from his. Oh, and I see there's some great conversation in the chat as well. So if you get bored of listening to me, I recommend that you read that. So this is Borbeli, contemporary Hungarian poet, died 2014, thinking very explicitly about how the perpetrators of the Holocaust fit into Jewish memory. I do want to look at this poem by Linda Paston. I don't know if people are familiar with her. She's a wonderful poet. She died in January. So I wanted to include her in this, thinking about memory as well. So this is called The Cossacks. And this is for her friend F, who was ill. But this is it. I love this poem. I think she's a phenomenal poet. I encourage anyone to read her. This is from a book of hers called The Last Uncle. She wrote a lot of books, though. So she writes, "For Jews, the Cossacks are always coming. Therefore, I think the sunspot on my arm is melanoma. Therefore, I celebrate New Year's Eve by counting my annual dead. My mother, when she was dying, spoke to her visitors of books and travel, displaying serenity as a form of manners, though I could tell the difference. But when I watched you planning for a life you knew you'd never have, I couldn't explain your genuine smile in the face of disaster. Was it denial laced with acceptance? Or was it generations of being English, Bronte's Lucy and Villette, living as if no fire raged beneath her dun-colored dress? I want to live the way you did, preparing for next year's famine with wine and music as if it were a 10-course banquet. But listen, those are hoofbeats on the frosty autumn air." I'm fascinated by this poem. I'll scroll up and just sort of slowly go down again as I speak in case people want to reread it. I'm fascinated because it's drawing an explicit distinction between the poet's Jewish memory and the poet's friend's non-Jewish memory, right? His English memory, as she calls it, was generations of being English. So for her, right, for Jews, the Cossacks are always coming. So that's an argument about Jewish memory in itself, right? That our memories of the past never end. They're never confined to memory, but they persist into the present and they extend beyond the particular circumstances. So the Cossacks are coming, therefore I probably have melanoma. I don't know if you agree that that's a distinctly Jewish way of thinking, but I think we can recognize that in a certain way. And then that gets compared with the this approach to life that's much more celebratory, much more optimistic. And she says quite explicitly, I want that. I want to live the way you did. But listen, those are hoofbeats on the frosty autumn air. It's a great last two lines of the poem. As we turn back, and the poem really brings us by saying, listen. And on some level, she's saying that to her friend. On some level, I think she's also saying that to us as her readers. Listen, it's an imperative. Listen to the ways that these traumatic memories are still alive. And if you start to listen, maybe you'll hear them too. I think that's what she's inviting us to do. Anyone have any thoughts or questions or responses about this poem? Yeah, Gary. Let's see. Oh, I have to allow you. Okay, great.
There we go. Okay,
Yes.
now I can speak. Okay. I think there's a really critical distinction between optimism and hope. Where, optimism is this kind of, she points out, was it denial? Optimism is, having this kind of Pollyanna-ish view that, oh, well, no matter what, the future is going to be fine. I anticipate all kinds of good things are going to happen. Hope is really more of a realistic understanding that the future is not guaranteed, but that there is a possibility, that there are always possibilities that things will go better than might be expected, right? Which is a very different concept, I think, from, from optimism. I mean, because optimism is more of a passive thing, right? I mean, whereas hope means if I engage and I do what I hope will make a difference, maybe the outcome will improve, maybe something better will happen, and that I am an active agent, that I have agency, right? That I have free will, and that I can do something to make a difference in the outcome here. And I think Judaism encourages hope. I mean, I think Judaism is in the face of all kinds of horrible things that have happened, somehow we have survived as a people, right? Longer than just about any other civilization, than any other family on the earth. We've somehow survived all these horrible things that have happened throughout our history. How is that? Why weren't we just wiped out at some point?
Yeah, Gary, what I'm hearing you say, I'm putting this together with our conversation about the previous poem. And what I'm hearing you say is that optimism is saying, well, maybe 2 times 2 can be 7. And then that'll be amazing. It'll be what I need. Right?
Yeah.
This kind of magical thinking. Whereas
yeah.
Hope, as your understanding, is 2 by 2 is 4. 2 times 2 is 4. It's going to be 4. Nevertheless, even within these laws of reality and their brutality, sometimes we can still find options or opportunities for life and miracles and all kinds of things like that.
I think it's even deeper than that.
Great.
that there is a hidden relational reality, which is the realm of the deity. Okay, I mean, it is the realm of possibility, right? It's the idea that God tells Abraham he's going to have a son, and Sarah laughs and says, "Oh, that's just a joke. Like, how is that going to happen?" And then it happens, right? I mean, the Bible is telling us that, there is this realm of possibility that, out of which our world of physical actuality comes, right? I mean, where we live, in the physical presence is not our reality. It is.
Yeah.
And this is actually true in quantum science. I mean, quantum physics, this idea of that there is a hidden relational reality that is the realm of possibility is, I think, incredibly powerful, because it is always a cause for hope, a justification for hope.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Gary. And one of the things I see in this poem, and in some way or another in every poem that we've looked at here, is an interplay of those things. There is hope, and we can prepare for a famine with a banquet. And at the same time, we carry this memory with us of those Cossack hoofbeats. And so both of these things are true at the same time.
Yes.
Chaya, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Sorry, I'm just thinking, I also think that the hoofbeats sort of is at the end there are sort of an affirmation of the fact that, like, in a certain way, I think that's what the poem's saying, maybe, is that, like, these threats are not really behind us, which I think, like, sort of, we often talk sort of self-deprecatingly of, like, oh, Jews are always so pessimistic and stuff, and we can't move on. We're always sure that, but I wonder if the poem's kind of saying, like, what, it's kind of justified, like, and like the, like, trauma in our history is not something that we can move past, because it's not something, like, we can't really be sure it's not going to happen again. And it's, which I'm kind of pushing back, I think, sort of this I think, common like complacent, like, oh, like now, like America's perfect and nothing bad is ever going to happen again. And I wonder if she's saying, like, throughout the poem, she's saying, like, you know, hey, we can't move past this trauma. And I wonder that last bit is like, she's kind of being like, yeah, it's kind of like, maybe we should keep our passports up to date, you know, like it's actually not a crazy thing to do from a practical perspective. So I wonder if there's a little element of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great because it starts with this moment of, right, the Cossacks are always coming. Therefore, I think the sunspot on my arm is melanoma, which is kind of this like funny moment, like, ha ha ha, us Jews, we have this trauma and it makes us so anxious. But I think you're right that by the end of it, it's not a joke anymore. That it's like, it goes from, oh yeah, we carry these crazy traumatic memories with us, to the place of, but maybe we should, maybe there's actual necessity in carrying our memories in this way. And yes, it's like this jokey, annoying thing that we have these anxieties and pessimisms, but maybe it's also necessary in order to continue to save our lives.
I was thinking, and I had to laugh when Haya mentioned passports, because I had the experience recently where someone was checking my passport and told me it was expired, and I had like a mini heart attack because I have committed to memory when I need to get my passport renewed. I'm not going to let that happen. And of course, you know, she was wrong, I was right. But we have this way of sort of adding additional things into our memory. We know what we have to look at. We have to look at, again, like the passport. We have to look at different things happening in society. And people love saying, you know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But I think that this is kind of pointing towards maybe a sort of privilege of only being, you know, focused on history as opposed to really internalizing memory. And again, like Jews, like we laugh about it, but other communities that have experienced traumas, they also, you know, experience things of this sort, even if it's something small. You know, people whose families dealt with famine very often have a mother who refused to let there be any empty space in the pantry. And, you know, we'll joke about it, but you also know that that family's never going to starve. And that family has starved before, and that family doesn't need to go to the store when everyone's hoarding stuff before a storm or during a pandemic or whatever, because they have that little sentinel response that's based in memory rather than history of, you know, July 4th, 1923, you know, whatever happened on a specific day. So I think that contrast comes up here.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I know we're out of time. So what I would like to do, there's a Yehuda Amichai poem at the end of this. We're going to save that for next week because that's worth really talking about. But I want to end on this poem by Richard Chess called Holocaust Day, because
it is Holocaust Day.
It is Holocaust Day. Richard Chess, also someone I really highly recommend to read if you're not familiar with him. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina, has written several wonderful poetry collections. He's also just really a sweet, menschy person. And so this is his poem, Holocaust Day. And we'll close with this one tonight. So, why cease our mourning? So what if years have passed, if years are slabs on which condos have been built and we've moved in? The distance between us and the immeasurable is no more than the distance between two rooms, even if the wall is a heaving ocean. When the coffee in our cups disturbed, we believe a bone in a mound of bones a continent away has shifted to trigger this local tremor. When we're moved to kiss a stranger on the street, we feel true to a young couple long ago interrupted. Our neighbors never can be just neighbors. We embrace them like family. They will betray us to the dogs that roam the neighborhood, the gentlemen who read our meters, the flags snapping on Independence Day. Like saplings planted in barren yards, our lamentations will mature long after we have crumbled. There's a lot we could say about this poem. It's a complicated poem, and we don't have time to say any of the worthwhile things about it. I'll just point out briefly, though, that I really think this is another poem that really argues for how Jewish memory lives in our lives, right? When the coffee in our cups disturbed, we believe a bone in a mound of bones a continent away has shifted to trigger this local tremor. Right? So these quotidian moments of our lives, we experience something happening and we tie it, this poem says, to something related to our dead a continent away. And I think that's a really interesting claim about Jewish memory and how Jewish memory works and how the past intersects with the present. I really wish we had more time to talk about this poem. But these last two lines as well I want to just mention. Our lamentations will mature long after we have crumbled. And so to me, that suggests that the liturgies we come up with, the ways that we memorialize, the ways that we relate to our painful past, those things are going to outlive us. Not just outlive us, but keep growing and grow into new life even after we're gone. So the memories we create and the ways that we express our memories are actually what will be our descendants in some important way. But we don't really have time for more. I've already gone over time. I'm happy to stay here and keep chatting about any of this. But really, I just want to thank you all for tuning in, for being a part of this. Really grateful for this opportunity to share these poems. And next week, we'll just spend the whole time talking about poems and just dive right into the poetry from the beginning. So hoping to see you there and really looking forward to it.
Okay, wonderful. If anyone has additional question or thought before we wrap it up, please feel free. Going once. Gary, go ahead.
I just want to make one comment about the bones, the mounds of bones.
Yeah.
And Ezekiel.
Yes, totally.
Right. The idea that there can be a valley full of bones and yet they can come back to life. Right. The sinews can form. It's one of the most amazing pieces of literature. I mean, when you really read the description of how this actually happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the Haftorah, what, 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
I can't remember now.
Yeah. Yes.
But yeah, totally. I think the Ezekiel reference is totally there. Yeah, Chaya, did you want to add something?
Sorry, I can restrain myself if we don't have time. Or we good?
Go
Okay,
for
thank
it. Go for it.
I am really caught on this when we're moved to kiss a stranger on the street. We feel this
Yes.
true. Wow. I'm like, but I'm wondering, like, first of all, I sort of love whatever. Okay, sorry, be to the point. But I kind of feel like what it's saying is like, and there's so many ways. Okay, sorry, I'll just say it. But like the idea that there's like a lot of living and loving for us to do that those people didn't get to do is something that like, obviously like that kind of Holocaust memory of like responsibility and pressure to like have 1 million kids. I mean, have 6 million kids, and pressure to like live our lives for the people who can't is like something that's like a really complicated thing that I won't get into like all of that. But I kind of love this sort of I don't know what to call it, but the idea that there's this love that needs to be acted upon. I don't know. I'm just super intrigued by it, and I like it. I love the idea that you can love on their behalf. I don't know. I'm just
agree
excited
completely.
about it.
No, I think that's totally right and
That's
totally
huge.
well said. And it makes me think of this Radnoti poem, right? This poem that he wrote to his wife. She survived. He didn't. And that actually there's this, that love didn't go anywhere, but it persists in some way. And not just persists, but is actually part of our experience. Something that is in the ether and we tap into it. And when we feel this loving urge, right? Maybe it was what he was writing in that poem that he never got to actualize, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, I'm just rambling in response to this, but I think you're totally right, and I love that as well.
Yeah, I'm teaching a course on Levinas, who's like, I think, one of the most important post-Holocaust writers and philosophers. And this is basically what he's saying, is that love has to be the first response. That's what, that's what Rabbi Hillel the Elder said, right? I mean, love mankind, 2 words, love mankind. And I think what the poem is saying is that we will love regardless of what the eventual outcome will be, right? I mean, that it's within our capacity to reach out and to treat others as family, even if they're going to turn around and cut our throats.
Yeah. And I would say, I'll just say briefly, maybe not just regardless of what the outcome will be, but because we know that that might happen, not even if they'll turn, because they might cut our throats, we'll love. That's one of the things I see in this poem. But yeah, Dad, real quick, and then we'll call it a night. No, you're fine.
Just the last 2 lines, which I no longer can see, but it says, my lamentations will mature long after I have withered, stands in juxtaposition to me to the famous story of the person planting the olive tree, knowing that that will mature long after he has withered. So he's like planting well, it's the lamentations that will survive and thrive, as opposed to the olive tree.
Yes. Yeah, it's really interesting that it's the lamentations, right? Not the love, not the kisses.
Right.
But that's the note that he ends on. Really, that's
Right.
fascinating to me as well. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Really grateful to have you all here and to be able to read these poems together and have these wonderful conversations together. And looking forward to many more next week and the week after.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you. Thank you,
As
Jen.
always, Mr. Kraft, for a wonderful, wonderful class, and to everyone here for participating, being part of our learning community. It's always a delight, which, I mean, given the nature of some of the work, that says a lot about your teaching abilities here and your ability to lead a group in these texts. So,
Thank you.
Folks are welcome to join us for other classes that we have coming up. And I know that there were some registration issues with this class. We will be looking into them and hopefully getting things fixed up. Technology isn't perfect. People aren't perfect. And when you put us together, surprisingly, not perfect. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful night, wonderful week.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Noah.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thanks for
Daniel.
your behind the scenes work on this. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
cool. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.